LiberalViewer presents.
So, welcome to the August 7th edition of LiberalViewer Monday Media Mixup. Thanks for joining me. I'll be using the 11 best, most newsworthy clips I picked out from the Sunday morning news analysis shows from the big five corporate outlets of ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and Fox News, the so-called corporate media here in the United States, for what should be a really informative, educational, fair use media criticism and political commentary show for you all today. I will also be using my background as an attorney who both practiced criminal law and did some work on First Amendment free speech issues to analyze whether Donald Trump has a free speech defense to the big story of the week. Donald Trump was arraigned on charges related to his attempts to overturn the results of the 2020 election, and you can see that in the title of the video. I couldn't fit in the title, but I'm also going to be taking on his reliance on counsel defense. Donald Trump's attorney, John Lauro, did what they call the full Ginsburg, which goes back to Monica Lewinsky's attorney, who was like the first to go on all 5 of the Sunday morning shows I cover. Well, John Lauro, Donald Trump's attorney, did that yesterday, and I have clips of him, a couple clips of the anchors trying to cross-examine him on the First Amendment defense, and then a couple clips on the reliance on counsel defense. I'll also have a clip of Bill Barr, the Attorney General under Trump, right up until almost the very end, who also doesn't believe in the First Amendment defense. And anyway, I'll be showing you some screenshots of statutes and model jury instruction, and all the sources I'm using are down in the video description under sources. Also under media mentioned, I have short summaries of all the clips I'm using, including the first clip, which is what I'm using for political commentary. It's actually from what I'm using for political comedy this week is what I meant to say. And it is a clip from the Mehdi Hasan show. Mehdi Hasan is MSNBC anchor and commentator, and also a lawyer, I believe, but he tried to take on a problem that later in the ABC News This Week with George Stephanopoulos news summary, you'll see they also try to take on this problem of how do you keep people from getting numb to how unprecedented and outrageous and just different things are that are happening with Donald Trump. This is like a big problem that for my longtime viewers, the media dealt with throughout the Trump presidency. Like, how do you keep reporting on someone who is like destroying institutions and lying like dozens of times a week, and if not per day or whatever? Anyway, Mehdi Hasan does what George Stephanopoulos and Jon Karl also try to do in their news summary coming up. But here's Mehdi Hasan with a 60-second rant on all the things that are firsts and unprecedented from Trump. There are a couple things I think he might have left out, but I'll talk about that a little more after we watch this political comedy clip. Although it's kind of dark comedy, I guess, for the program today over here.
It's time for what I like to call the 60-second rant, because with all these indictments of Donald Trump, it's worth stopping to consider how unprecedented this all is. Trump is like no other president or presidential candidate in American history. He has a list of firsts that no one should want. Give me 60 seconds to remind you. Start the clock. Donald Trump is the first former president to be indicted for a state crime after being indicted by the Manhattan District Attorney over hush money payments to a porn star in April. The first former president to be indicted for a federal crime after being indicted by Special Counsel Jack Smith under the Espionage Act in June for unauthorized retention of classified documents and conspiracy to obstruct justice, among other charges. The first former president to be indicted for a federal crime for acts committed while in office after being indicted by Special Counsel Jack Smith this past Tuesday for trying to overturn the 2020 election via lies, fraud, and conspiracy. The first former president to be found liable of sexual abuse in a New York courtroom in May. The first major party presidential candidate who, come election year, will literally be on trial for crimes, multiple trials in multiple jurisdictions. The first president to repeatedly refuse to release details of his taxes since presidents started voluntarily doing so 50 years ago. The first president to be impeached twice for abuse of power and obstruction of Congress in 2019 and for inciting an insurrection in 2021. The first president who had a member of his own party vote to convict him in the Senate. The first president ever to refuse to concede defeat in an election. The first president in over a century to boycott his successor's inauguration. The first president to incite an insurrection in the nation's capital. And therefore the first president to ever violate the peaceful transfer of power since this country began.
So So what do you think? I mean, a couple of those seem to be stretching a little in that they weren't actually first. There was like the first president to boycott his successor's inauguration in like 100 years, or not to release taxes just since like the Nixon uh, impeach or near impeachment. But most of those were good. But there are also a couple things left out. I would say they'd be like, I don't know, first president to side with a dictator at a press conference over his own intelligence services. That was like a huge low for Trump. I remember that Helsinki press conference. What else? The first president to say that people fighting against fascism are just as bad as fascists. That was like what I thought the big, people talk about the good people, fine people on both sides, which then there are people on the right. This is after Charlottesville, the march there that ended in the death of Heather Heyer, I believe was the name of the woman who died, and there was the whole Tiki Torch march, and anyway, there are a lot of. I'm going off on a huge tangent here, and I'm really just in order to use that pretty good writing there by Mehdi Hasan. Mehdi Hasan, I wanted to. Say some of the things that maybe shouldn't have been on the list and some things that weren't on the list that should have been. And anyway, that was what I'm using for political comedy. Is that even comedy? You can let me know what you think in the comments section while I move on to the 5 news summaries from the big 5 corporate outlets from longest to shortest. There were 2 that are over 4 minutes, and then the other 3 are all around a minute. So the 2 best were NBC News Meet the Press and ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos. I think maybe the second one was better, but NBC News Meet the Press, they actually talk about all the charges, at least. The Trump is being charged for 3 conspiracies, 1 to defraud the United States, 1 to deprive voters of their rights, and 1 to corruptly obstruct an official government proceeding. That's our old friend 18 U.S.C. 1512 sub C sub 2. I'll get to a little bit later. But before I get to that, to talk about, so that'll be when I get to the newsmaker clips that I already told you about, all the clips of John Lauro as well as one of Bill Barr. But here's the longest of the news summaries from NBC News' Meet the Press. Chuck Todd also giving you some poll numbers and political reactions. I don't know. You can tell me, is this the best news summary, or is the ABC one after this the best one? They're both pretty good, and I'll talk about this one a little more after we watch it together over here.
Sunday morning, voters next fall may be faced with an unprecedented choice, whether to put former President Donald Trump back in the White House or to essentially sign off on his sentencing if he is convicted and send him to prison or a Secret Service protected home confinement. The latest federal indictment accuses Trump of 3 conspiracies: 1 to defraud the United States, another to deprive voters of a civil right to have their votes counted, and 2 counts of corruptly obstructing an official government proceeding, the certification of the Electoral College vote. The indictment details how Trump was told by his vice president, senior Justice Department leaders who he had appointed, the director of national intelligence who he had hired, senior White House lawyers who he had hired, his cybersecurity agency, senior campaign staffers, state legislators, many of whom endorsed him, and state and federal courts, and that there was no evidence of election fraud and that he had lost the election. Trump's campaign even paid 2 outside research firms to try to prove his electoral fraud claims. But they never released the findings because the firms disputed his theories, and they could not offer any proof that he had won. And Trump is alleged to have repeatedly acknowledged in private that he actually lost the election, in contrast to his public statements. And yet, as the indictment lays out, it was not illegal in and of itself for Trump to lie. That is protected speech. But it was the actions the indictment alleges that he took that were illegal, using claims of election fraud that he knew were false to try to get state officials to change electoral votes, organizing fraudulent slates of electors in 7 targeted swing states, deceiving them in many cases to sign on to the scheme, sending states' Justice Department letters falsely claiming that there were concerns about a specific state's election outcome, pressuring Vice President Pence to use his ceremonial role to fraudulently alter the election results instead of simply certifying them. And even after an angry crowd violently attacked the Capitol, he still tried to persuade members of Congress to prevent certification. In many ways, the predicate was set here on day one of the Trump administration when the president directed his aides to insist on an easily disprovable lie about his inaugural crowd size, arguing that more people witnessed Donald Trump's inauguration than President Obama's, despite the video evidence. And a day later here on Meet the Press, the president's counselor, Kellyanne Conway, offered this awkward explanation.
You're saying it's a falsehood, and they're giving Sean Spicer, our press secretary, gave alternative facts to that. But the point remains.
Wait a minute. Alternative facts? Look, alternative facts are not facts. They're falsehoods. So his presidency began with alternative facts and apparently ended with alternate electors. And it may all add up to a scenario where voters have to decide whether to put Trump back in the Oval Office before he is sentenced. Let's not forget that Republican senators decided not to hold the president accountable via the process that the founders believed was the better process for this, impeachment. In fact, this was Republican Senate Leader Mitch McConnell explaining his vote to acquit Trump after January 6th.
President Trump is still liable for everything he did while he was in office as an ordinary citizen. We have a criminal justice system in this country. We have civil litigation. And former presidents are not immune from being accountable by either one.
So instead of doing the tough work in the Senate, they left it to the voters, who are going to be stuck with the burden of upholding the rule of law if Trump is convicted. An unprecedented test of our democracy. Prosecutors have asked the judge in the January 6th case to issue a protective order over discovery evidence after Trump posted this on Friday on social media. "If you go after me, I'm coming after you," citing Trump's habit of attacking judges, attorneys, and others associated with legal matters pending against him. And while they claimed that social media post was on something else, not on this, last night in South Carolina, Trump didn't do anything subtly. He attacked special counsel Jack Smith directly.
Deranged Jack Smith. He's a deranged human being. You take a look at that face, you say, that guy is a sick man. There's something wrong with him.
And joining me now is one of Donald Trump's attorneys in this specific case, John Lauro.
And like I said, I will have clips of John Lauro from 4 of the 5 programs. He appeared on all 5, did the full Ginsburg that I was talking about earlier. But I actually like that news summary there. Chuck Todd explained all the charges. He went all the way back to Trump's inauguration and Sean Spicer's crowd size lies, and even his interaction with Kellyanne Conway, the whole alternative facts thing that kind of defined the Trump presidency from the beginning. I found that kind of amusing and interesting. And also the clip of Mitch McConnell right after January 6th saying that Trump could be found accountable or could be held accountable in the criminal justice system. I also like this ABC This Week with George Stephanopoulos news summary. They have like 2 anchors on this one. It's both George Stephanopoulos and Jon Karl, and they cover a lot of the same stuff. Like I said, I think they try to address what Mehdi Hasan said in the first clip I showed. How do we keep remembering that what's happening is unprecedented? It's like Trump has taken our nation to a place we've never been before, and we should not stop being shocked and outraged. George Stephanopoulos, I think, addresses that pretty well in the beginning of this news summary. And instead of Mitch McConnell, I think you see some like really bogus analogies from Kevin McCarthy, the Speaker of the House, in this next news summary, where he tries to say, Trump didn't do anything more than Al Gore did in 2000 or Hillary Clinton, both of whom conceded the election. Al Gore not till December because of the whole fight through the Supreme Court. But Hillary Clinton, within a few days of her loss in 2016, conceded the election, or maybe even less than a few days. But anyway, that's all in this next news summary, which I also think is pretty good. You can tell me, is it better or worse than the NBC one I just showed you? Let me know what you think in the comment section, and I'll talk about it a little more after we watch that news summary together over here.
Good morning and welcome to This Week. The great challenge of covering this Trump era has been preventing the unprecedented from becoming routine, turning historic events into the same old news. I don't pretend to have a full answer to that challenge, but I do believe that one antidote is reporting and repeating stark facts. We crossed a monumental threshold this week. It's the first time the federal government has charged a former president with defrauding the country. It's the first time the federal government has charged a former president with obstructing the congressional count of electoral votes. It's the first time the federal government has charged a former president with engaging in a criminal conspiracy to deprive millions of American citizens the right to have their votes counted. Donald Trump will eventually have his day in court. The bottom line for now, in these early days of the presidential campaign, is this. The leading Republican candidate has been credibly accused of trying to destroy the democracy he wants to lead. We're going to speak with Trump's attorney in a moment. Chief Washington correspondent Jon Karl starts us off.
When Donald Trump stood before a federal judge in Washington this week, he became the 1,090th person charged in connection with the January 6th assault on the U.S. Capitol. This may have been Trump's third indictment, but this one is different. Not because he faces a maximum sentence of 45 years in prison. The maximum in the classified documents case is even higher, but because it accuses him of betraying the very oath of office he hopes to take once again. The charges include defrauding the United States and depriving the rights of Americans to have their votes count, a right central to the meaning of democracy. As with all those other defendants who have appeared in that same courthouse, the judge told him, "You have the right to remain silent." As a condition of his release, he is not allowed to talk to other witnesses about the case, even though he could find himself on a debate stage with one of the prosecution's leading witnesses, former Vice President Mike Pence, who is now saying Trump is disqualified from ever again holding the office of president because of what he did on January 6th.
I really do believe that anyone who puts himself over the Constitution should never be president of the United States.
But it is Trump, not Pence or anyone else, who is the far and away frontrunner for the Republican presidential nomination. None of the many charges he faces have hurt him. In fact, they have become the animating message of his campaign, one he hit again minutes after pleading not guilty in Washington.
This is a persecution of a political opponent.
A large number of Republican voters seem to agree. Party leaders, too. Speaker of the House Kevin McCarthy going so far as to say Trump is being prosecuted for expressing an opinion, bizarrely comparing Trump's efforts to overturn the election with how Hillary Clinton and Al Gore handled their defeats.
And I can say the same thing that Hillary Clinton says about her election that she lost. I can say the same thing about the DNC, who said it about the 2016 race. I can say the same thing about those in the Democratic Party from the leadership on down about George Bush not winning, that Al Gore did. But were any of them prosecuted? Were any of them put in jail?
Except there was no insurrection after Al Gore and Hillary Clinton lost. Both did something Trump never did. They conceded. While Trump seems as strong as ever among Republicans, a new ABC Ipsos poll shows 65% of all adults say the charges against Trump are serious. A majority say he should have been charged with a crime. Nearly half say the charges are politically motivated, but just as many say Trump should suspend his campaign. He won't, of course, but the campaign calendar is now on a collision course with the legal calendar. The first hearing in the January 6th case scheduled for just 5 days after the first Republican debate. The New York trial in the hush money case scheduled for the middle of the Republican primaries. The classified documents trial scheduled for just weeks before the Republican convention, with more court dates and likely even more charges still to come.
Thanks, Jon Karl, for that. We're joined now by Donald Trump's attorney, John Lauro.
And like I said, I will have 4 clips of 4 different interviews with Donald Trump's attorney, Jon Lauro. But I pretty much pre-criticized that clip. One thing that I forgot to say about the NBC News Meet the Press news summary before that I liked was the way they took the free speech defense head on and talked about how it wasn't just speech, it was also conduct, and it was this whole scheme to create these fake electors. And I think it's like 7 different states. I have to go back and look at the indictment again. But there are all sorts of like concrete actions in addition to speech. Not that a crime can't be made up entirely of speech, but I will get to that. How a crime can be made up of speech in ways that we all know after I finish the news summaries. Those were the 2 long ones. You can let me know if you think the ABC or the NBC News one was the best. The Fox News Sunday news summary was definitely not the best. You'll see Shannon Bream here starts off talking about it as if it's all political. She puts it in, puts it in that whole Republican narrative, because of course Fox News is not a journalistic outlet. It was, for example, you can read this book over here, The Loudest Voice in the Room by Gabriel Sherman, that will tell you the story of how Roger Ailes created Fox News to be a propaganda outlet of the Republican Party, which in fact it turned out to be. And that's why I was able to make hundreds of Fox News bias videos over the years on my YouTube channel, and why you're going to see Shannon Bream's like 1-minute news summary here. Not only does she talk about it as like unprecedented week in politics, it's all about politics. She also like emphasizes in her intro really strongly, Trump says not guilty, which is fine. He is presumed innocent. He gets to plead not guilty. And then they talk about Trump's legal schedule, but they only talk about a few things. There's like so much more on his legal schedule you already saw in the previous news summaries. They only talk about a few things. And then somehow they fit in Biden's age and Hunter Biden all within the 1-minute news summary that I'll talk about with you a little more, if you can call it news. 1-minute news summary I'll talk about with you a little more after we watch together over here.
From Fox News in Washington, another unprecedented week in presidential politics, with all the attention on Donald Trump, the former president and dominant frontrunner for the Republican nomination. This time, back here in the nation's capital, where he pleaded not guilty to felony counts in special counsel Jack Smith's investigation into alleged efforts to overturn the 2020 election. Trump will not appear in person this Thursday in Florida after he pleaded not guilty to new charges in a superseding indictment related to the classified documents case there. That same day, there is a hearing on a motion filed by Trump's team in Georgia to remove the Fulton County DA from her investigation into alleged efforts to overturn election results in that state. Bonnie Willis has indicated an indictment of Trump or others could be imminent. All of this attention deflecting from the rest of the GOP field, vying for the White House in 2024, and from President Biden, who at 80 years old is running for a second 4-year term and could face a potential campaign liability in his son Hunter's own legal troubles. Let's turn now to Trump attorney Jon Karl.
And again, I will have a clip of Shannon Bream's Jon Karl interview, where I don't think she does a very good job of cross-examining him on the First Amendment issues. And I will get to the newsmaker clips pretty quickly. And I pretty much pre-criticized that clip. And now we watch together, and isn't what I said true? Yes. That was the most partisan political spin, where Shannon Bream put it in like a total presidential politics narrative, and somehow mentioned Biden's age and Hunter Biden within like a 1-minute news summary. You can tell me what you think in the comments section as I show you these last 2 news summaries, which are like even less than a minute. First, CBS News Face the Nation. Major Garrett, who used to be on Fox News, but has like come away from the dark side and although sometimes CBS News Face the Nation, I've said, is like Fox News Light for various reasons. But this news summary is okay, although, spoiler alert, they're going to tell you who won the the U.S. women's soccer game over the weekend, which now it's not much of a spoiler, but Sunday morning when they started the program with it, it might have spoiled it for some people. And is it really like the top story, or just because it's breaking, or I don't know why, but I'll talk about that a little more after we watch that brief news summary together over here.
Good morning. Welcome to Face the Nation. Margaret is off today. As we come on the air this morning, disappointing news from Australia as the U.S. women's soccer team has lost its knockout round match to Sweden and has therefore been eliminated in the World Cup. Here in the U.S., the impact of former President Trump's third criminal indictment has not only underscored divisions in our country between the parties, but it appears that Republicans are also divided as well, with some Trump supporters still believing he did nothing wrong, others not so sure. And in that light, we begin today with former Vice President Mike Pence, a man once seen as extremely loyal to Trump, that is, until they lost the 2020 election, at which point Pence says Trump pressured him to try to overturn the election and in their favor. We spoke with Pence in New Hampshire yesterday.
And actually, Mike Pence was on a couple of the programs, although pre-recorded an interview on Saturday, so couldn't really respond to what other guests were saying. And I didn't take any Mike Pence clips, but he did say that Trump not only tried to pressure him to pause the votes, but also to actually reject votes so that the whole thing was thrown into the House of Representatives, and that would have created chaos. And that speech asking the vice president to do something which is illegal and obstructs an official proceeding. You're just using speech to ask him to do that. You'll see later John Lauro tries to make that argument, but I'll get to that when I get to John Lauro making that free speech argument about what Trump said to Mike Pence. It was just aspirational. He was just asking. That's one of the sillier arguments that the Trump lawyer makes that I'll get to in a little bit. But first, I want to finish the news summaries with the CNN State of the Union one, Dana Bash. I think covering the news pretty well in 49 seconds, and I'll talk about that a little more after we watch those 49 seconds together over here.
Hello, I'm Dana Bash in Washington, where the State of our Union is watching court filings pile up. Donald Trump is kicking off a new week, juggling an ever more crowded legal calendar after his third indictment over alleged attempts to overturn the 2020 election. As usual, the former president is lashing out at the legal system and those he perceives to be his enemies. Last night, he called special counsel Jack Smith, quote, mentally ill and, quote, deranged. And a Trump campaign advisor told CNN the president has no plans to change his rhetoric. Even as in federal court this weekend, Trump's attorneys worked to respond to a filing by the Justice Department, which took issue with a new threatening social media post by Trump. Here with me now is Trump attorney Jon Lauro. Thank you so much for joining.
And I will have a clip of Dana Bash talking to Trump attorney Jon Lauro, although actually to give Dana Bash some credit that she won't get from the clip I'm going to show later, at the very beginning of the interview, Jon Lauro did this thing he did in all of the interviews where he referred to the special counsel prosecutors Jack Smith and the other people in this prosecution as the Biden administration, when the Biden administration has actually taken all these steps to separate that off so that it's not really accurate. But that's, of course, what Jon Lauro tried to say on all 5 of the networks, and the only person who pushed back was Dana Bash, and he actually got him to change his wording where he just called them the prosecutors instead of the Biden administration. But in all the other interviews, he just called the Jack Smith special counsel prosecutors the Biden administration without any pushback. But before I get to Dana Bash's actual clip, which is actually the second newsmaker clip, the first of the Jon Lauro clips I'm going to show you, which is on the First Amendment defense. Like I said in my title, I'm going to give you some legal analysis on whether Trump really has a First Amendment defense to the charges. But first, I'm going to show you a CBS News Face the Nation clip. Bill Barr, Trump's former attorney general, also saying, although he thought after January 6th that there might be some First Amendment problems with prosecuting Trump. And for my longtime viewers, I actually agree with what Bill Barr says at the beginning, or his old quote that CBS's Major Garrett asks him about at the beginning of this clip I'm about to show you. Apparently, Bill Barr said after January 6th that to prosecute Trump for like what he said on January 6th, like as incitement to insurrection, that kind of thing, that would have First Amendment problems. And I actually agreed with that because the incitement standard is very strict. You have to incite people to commit a crime, you have to say something that you know is going to likely result in their unlawful action. You have to intend for them to have it has to be imminent unlawful action. That's like the Brandenburg standard. And so Trump's speech, it was kind of a political speech, on his speech on the ellipse. If they were charging him with that, I might actually agree with the First Amendment defense. But that's not what they're charging him with, not for inciting the people to go march on Congress. That's like some of the facts in the indictment. But I mean, and there are parts in the speech where he says, like, let's go peacefully, or he uses the word peacefully a couple times in the speech too. And it really doesn't meet the Brandenburg test. But so I agree with what Bill Barr is being asked about here. But then he doesn't do a great job of explaining how in free speech doesn't give you a right to engage in a conspiracy, but he doesn't really explain what that means. And I'll talk about that a little more after we watch that clip together over here.
Last time you were on the show, you said, quote, the January 6th case will be a hard case to make because of First Amendment interest, unquote. Having read the indictment, is that still your view?
Well, it's certainly a challenging case, but I don't think it runs afoul of the First Amendment. And there's a lot of confusion about this out there. Maybe I can crystallize it. This involved a situation where the states had already made the official and authoritative determination as to who won in those states, and they sent the votes and certified them to Congress. The allegation, essentially, by the government is that at that point, the president conspired, entered into a plan, a scheme that involved a lot of deceit, the object of which was to erase those votes, to nullify those lawful votes.
To disenfranchise people.
Right. And there were a number of things that were alleged. One of them is that they tried to bully the state authorities to withdraw their certification by citing instances of fraud. And what the indictment says is the stuff that they were spouting, they knew was wrong and false. This is not a question of what his subjective idea was as to whether he won or lost. They're saying what you were saying consistently, the stuff you were spouting, you knew was wrong. But it's not, if that was all it was about, I would be concerned on the First Amendment front. But they go beyond that. And the other elements were the substitution of bogus panels that were not authorized panels to claim that they had alternative votes. And then they and that was clearly wrong, and the certifications they signed were false. But then pressuring the vice president to use that as a pretext to adopt the Trump votes and reject the Biden votes, or even to delay it. It really doesn't matter whether it's to delay it or to adopt it or to send it to the House of Representatives. You have to remember, a conspiracy crime is completed at the time it's agreed to and the first steps are taken.
That's it.
That's when the crime is complete.
That actually, that's like the third time I've watched that clip, and it actually seemed better this time. I think he actually did a better job than I remembered of explaining that, although partway through he says, like, some of the stuff that really was enough to be a criminal offense, like pressuring all those state officials and using falsehoods. And when it go down in the video description under sources here, let me put that in the live chat here too. I don't know if you've read this actual full indictment here. This is from you can read it on the Justice Department website. Here, I'll put that in the live chat for the live viewers if you're trying to follow along on the Trump indictment. It goes through a long list of conduct where after the votes were certified, not only did Trump try to pressure all these state officials to change the certification in a way different from the way people voted, and what it includes is all these falsehoods, not like the point I was trying to make, not just like I believe I won the election and I really believe it and you can't prove I don't believe it, which is this weird defense they're trying to come up with, but they made all these specific allegations of fraud. If you read through that indictment, like specific, like all these undocumented immigrants voted, all these dead people voted. We have all this evidence of fraud, and they investigated it and they knew it wasn't true. They were saying all these untrue things, these false statements they knew were false. Not that I believe I won and no one can tell me otherwise defense, but like Trump and his co-conspirators were making false statements about outcome determinative fraud that they knew was not true to pressure state officials, and then these alternate electors that they tried to pass off as the real electors, where they signed affidavits and tried to get them to the vice president so that he would change the outcome of the election. That is like way beyond just like free speech, and it's part of a conspiracy to defraud the United States. It's part of a conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding. That's the proceeding where they were going to certify the votes, and I'm going to show you some statutes about that in just a minute after Oh, thank you, Tom Trask, for that super chat contribution. What are the odds that any of the Trump trial is televised? Well, both sides right now say that they want it to happen. It would require Congress to pass a law, or the Chief Justice to change the rule, or the Judicial Council, whatever, that oversees the federal rules. Those are like the three ways. I mean, it's possible. I'm hopeful, but I wouldn't hold my breath, I guess. But thank you for that question, Tom Trask. And now I'm going to show you the first John Lauro. This is John Lauro talking to CNN's Dana Bash, responding to some of the things. This is what I got confused. I believe Dana Bash actually shows John Lauro a worse explanation from Bill Barr about the free speech issue, where, free speech doesn't give you the right to engage in a conspiracy. This is the clip I was thinking of, where I don't think that Bill Barr does a great job of explaining why free speech doesn't apply here. He did a much better job in that clip I showed you. And then I'm going to talk about John Lauro's defense and why it's kind of bogus. And show you some statutes after we watch that clip together over, Dana Bash, John Lauro, and Dana Bash is going to ask him about the free speech defense, his First Amendment defense to charges that he tried to overturn the 2020 election over here.
You talked about freedom of speech a lot. I want you to listen to what Donald Trump's own former Attorney General said about that argument.
I really don't think that's a valid argument. He can say whatever he wants. He can even lie. He can even tell people that the election was stolen when he knew better. Free speech doesn't give you the right to engage in a fraudulent conspiracy.
Your response?
Well, first of all, there was no fraudulent conspiracy. That's part of the reality of the defense. What President Trump was entitled to do, and what Mr. Barr misses, and I'm not sure he's read all the cases, but when it comes to political speech, you can not only advocate for a position, but you can take action. You can petition. You can ask even your vice president to pause the vote for a period of time in order to allow the states to recertify.
But you can't break the law, which is what this indictment alleges.
What was it?
It alleges that he caused actions like approving fake.
What was it
I'll tell
that
you
was
what the
fraudulent.
I'll tell you what the
was
indictment.
What was that?
I'll tell you what the indictment says. The indictment
ahead.
says that
Right.
he attempted to cause actions like approving fake electors, opening sham fraud investigations, and obstructing the certification of the election. Whether he can prove that, that's going to happen in the trial. I'm just saying what's in the indictment.
Yeah, but right, and let me take the first thing, the question about electors, okay? Alternate electors are used in every 4-year cycles, okay? The Senate parliamentarian acknowledged to Vice President Pence that they always receive protest alternate electors. None of those electors were counted. Vice President Pence was completely aware of the nature of the
They
of
weren't
the protest,
counted because Mike Pence rejected this scheme. That's why they weren't counted.
Absolutely, and that's how the Of course, and that's how the political process works. But there was no defrauding, there was no trickery, there was no deceit
because
everybody knew
if Mike Pence had said yes, then that's exactly what would have happened.
No, because
and that's only one.
Because
I
thankfully, with
don't
freedom
wanna,
of the press, you
I don't
have
want
to
go down.
let me finish though, because No, but you asked me a question, and I hope you can let me finish, because the government alleges deceit or trickery, and all of this played out in the open. It's all free speech. There was a Supreme Court decision, Hammerschmidt, which is right on point, that says when you're exercising free speech, you're not engaging in a fraud on the government. And that's what, unfortunately, most people don't understand
That's just one example
now, it's
of
very
the
political.
actions. That's just one example of the actions in this indictment.
But you're entitled.
And this is a long list that we've compiled from the indictment. I mean, it's more than a dozen, not speech, actions that the former president allegedly took.
Like what?
I mean, where do I even start?
What? Tell me.
Asking the Arizona speaker to interfere with ascertaining Arizona's electors. The Justice Department to conduct
a speech.
But any alleged
asking is speech.
But any alleged almost all alleged criminal activity has to do with using words and is speech. And that's listen.
What you don't
this is obviously the defense that you're going to use, and it will be fascinating to see how it works out in a court of law. I want to move on to another issue.
I got to tell you though. But you make an interesting point, because you're saying that asking is action. No, asking is aspirational. Asking is not action. It's core free speech. The press should be defending free speech in this case.
Let's talk about something else that you've repeatedly said. And
asking is aspirational. Asking is free speech. Well, it depends on what you're asking. I mean, there are a lot of crimes that are involved in a lot of crimes charged that involve asking someone to commit a crime, especially conspiracies. Like, it reminds me in the movie The Untouchables, Robert De Niro plays Al Capone, and he says, "I want him dead. I want his family dead." That's aspirational. That's just asking, right? But that's also a crime, and it's a crime under federal law. Here, one of the statutes I put a link to down in the video description, 18 U.S.C. Section 2, principles. And whoever commits an offense against the United States or aids, abets, counsels, commands, induces, or procures its commission is punishable as a principle. So that means if you procure the commission of a crime, that's a crime under 18 U.S.C. Section 2. Asking someone to commit a crime is a crime. Now, he mentioned this Supreme Court case from 1924, the Hammerschmidt case. He mentioned it a couple times in a couple interviews, and I put a link down in the video description under sources where you can read the Hammerschmidt case. And the Hammerschmidt case is about the whether these people who are asking, who like stood outside the draft where people went to register for the draft in 1924 or in the 1920s after World War I, or I can't even remember exactly when the offense occurred, but the case is from 1924. And the case said that if you ask people not to register for the draft, even though that's a crime, that's not a conspiracy to defraud the United States. This it was a precursor to this 18 U.S. Code 371, conspiracy to commit offense or defraud the United States, where if two or more people conspire to commit any offense against the United States or to defraud the United States or any agency thereof in any manner for any purpose, or one or more such persons do an object of the conspiracy, each shall be fined, or whatever. So this statute, if you read the Hammerschmidt case, and I put a link down to it in the video description, but I didn't take a screenshot of it. Hold on. It doesn't say that that you can. Here, let me take a screenshot here and try. Hold on. I should have done this before the program, but here, let me just import it really quickly so you can see what I'm talking about. I hate it when this happens. So here we go. Sorry. So here is what the Hammerschmidt case says, that to conspire to defraud the United States means primarily to cheat the government out of property or money, but it also means to interfere with or obstruct any of the lawful government functions by deceit, craft, or trickery, or at least by means that are dishonest. And so in the Hammerschmidt case, the Supreme Court found that asking people not to register for the draft wasn't a conspiracy to defraud the United States because it didn't involve dishonesty or trickery or deceit or craft. It was just telling people you didn't want them to register. That doesn't mean that what Trump did to defraud the United States doesn't fit this statute, because there's plenty of evidence he used dishonesty, deceit, and trickery to defraud the United States. So the Hammerschmidt case, which John Lauro in one of the interviews said was exactly on point, was not on point at all. And so I wanted to point that out as well. And the other part about the free speech argument that I wanted to discuss was that speech by itself, lying by itself, is not a crime, but if you use those lies to obstruct an official proceeding, that is a corrupt obstruction of an official proceeding, and in this case, the official proceeding is the certification of the vote. For the last statute I showed you, the conspiracy to defraud the United States, the official function of government was the certification of votes under the Constitution, and this is on January 6th, and that's the official function that's obstructed under the next statute I wanted to show you here, 18 U.S.C. 1512 sub C sub 2, says whoever corruptly otherwise obstructs, influences, or impedes any official proceeding or attempts to do so shall be fined under this title or imprisoned for not more than 20 years or both. So 20 years in prison for corruptly obstructing an official proceeding. That means by trying to create these fake electors and then trying to get your vice president to accept the fake electors. It doesn't mean you don't have to succeed. That's one of the things John Lauro was saying. No one was deceived. Mike Pence knew that they were fake electors. Yeah, but you asked him to accept them and instead of the real electors and overturn the results of the election, which would be obstructing an official proceeding, and it would also be defrauding the United States because it was using fraud to stop an official function of government. And then the last way that speech is used to commit a crime is in this 18 U.S.C. section 241. That's the conspiracy to stop people from having their votes counted. I'm not going to go through and read the statute to you, but if you use intimidation or try to coerce people if you two or more people conspire to injure, oppress, threaten, or intimidate any person in any state, territory, commonwealth, or possession in the free exercise or enjoyment of any right or privilege. So that was like all the pressure put on state officials to not certify the legitimate outcome of the 2020 election. So I've gone over all the statutes there that I promised you I would go over. I still have a jury instruction on advice of counsel, relying on the advice of counsel, but I want to show an even worse job of cross-examining John Lauro on the free speech defense. Here you're going to see Shannon Bream ask, on the First Amendment issue, first, Shannon Bream just asks him about it generally and about speech and conduct, and then quotes the New Republic and lets John Lauro get away with a really bad rebuttal that I'll talk about a little more after we watch that clip together over here.
Let's talk about the charges, though. You say this is an attack on the First Amendment. The Justice Department recognizes that former President Trump had and has First Amendment rights to say things. In the indictment itself, it says this: the defendant had a right, like every American, to speak publicly about the election and even to claim falsely that there had been outcome determinative fraud during the election and that he had won. The rest of the indictment, though, is about the conduct, not just the speech.
Well, yeah, the First Amendment protects conduct as well as speech, but what the Justice Department, the Biden administration, doesn't do is reference what's the conduct at issue. President Trump did not issue any executive orders or do anything in terms of using the levers of executive power. He simply petitioned and asked state legislatures and state electoral officials around the country to act responsibly. In fact, he petitioned, not directed, he petitioned his own vice president ultimately to pause the voting on January 6th in order to allow the states to weigh in on auditing or recertifying. All of that is core First Amendment protected speech. In fact, everyone, whether you're a president of the United States or an ordinary citizen like you or me, can petition their government with grievances or requests to redress actions that were taken by the government. That's exactly what President Trump did. This is core political speech that's being attacked under the Biden plan.
You know, the argument here is that you can talk about a conspiracy, you can talk about anything you want to, but the allegation is that underlying conspiracy is not free because of free speech issues. I want to read something from New Republic. Says this: if this unbounded view of free speech applied consistently, it would eliminate most state and federal crimes. They say perjury is free speech, could be argued. Bribery is speech. Many types of fraud are speech. Insider trading is speech. Identity theft is speech. Forging checks is speech. They go on and on. They say First Amendment protects all kinds of things, but organizing a coup d'etat is not one of them. Your response?
Well, what do you think the obvious problem is with that statement? None of those examples involve political speech. That's the point. All of those examples involve core criminal activity. But what we have here is political speech where President Trump is petitioning the government, of course, saying something fraudulent in a prospectus or in an accounting statement is not protected, or robbing a bank is not protected. But all of those examples are ridiculous because the First Amendment protects political speech higher than any other speech. So the reality is that if you're going to talk about the law, you have to understand what the First Amendment says and what it stands for. And all of the examples in this indictment are core political speech. Every single thing that President Trump is being prosecuted for involved aspirational asks. Asking state legislatures, asking state governors, asking state electoral officials to do the right thing. In fact, even asking Vice President Pence was protected by free speech. None of that is illegal.
Okay, quickly.
We have the right in our system to petition our government.
I want to ask you quickly, you have said that you think that this move by the protective order is to keep people from seeing all of the information. So would
And you can see Shannon Bream didn't really follow up on any of that stuff. He said the aspirational asking thing again. Like, all he did was ask all these people, and he like slips in, do the right thing. No, ask them to commit a crime, to obstruct an official proceeding is what he asked the vice president to do, or asked them to defraud the United States by claiming that there was outcome determinative election fraud based on all these specific allegations of people who voted who shouldn't have voted, where they already knew those specific allegations were false. So there's that whole aspirational asking thing. Also, Shannon Bream used that New Republic quote and like, you know what they all have in common, and she doesn't say anything. None of them have to do with core political speech. Well, that's not even true. If you read that, first there were all these ellipses in there, but there was like, one of them was bribery. Bribery is core political speech, because of it's done corruptly with corrupt intent. You're petitioning your government, and you're not only petitioning, you're providing the cash to get what you want. But that's core political speech. That's a crime. Bribery was on the list. There's something like giving secrets to foreign governments. Well, that can be core political speech too. That's like Edward Snowden or Chelsea Manning, or that all is also can be core political speech that's also illegal and gets people put in prison, and the whole free speech defense is kind of ridiculous when you look at the statutes that I probably spent too long going over. But like I said, down in the video description under sources, you can look at the 18 U.S.C. Section 371. That's the conspiracy to defraud the United States. Also 18 U.S.C. Section 2 that says, like, if you ask someone to commit a crime, you're like just as guilty as the person who committed the crime. That's the asking aspirational thing is just a joke. Like, that makes it not a crime if you're asking someone to commit a crime. No, that's not true. And you can also look at 18 U.S.C. Section 1512 sub C sub 2, the corruptly obstructing an official proceeding, or scroll down a little and you'll see 18 U.S.C. Section 1512 sub K, which is just a conspiracy to violate any of the other parts of 18 U.S.C. Section 1512, including obstructing an official proceeding. And, you don't want to hear me read off all the statutes. There's one more, the depriving people of their right to vote and their right to have their vote counted. And those all involve speech, but the fact that they involve speech doesn't mean that violating them has a First Amendment defense. And now the next two clips I'm going to show you also have Trump's attorney try to claim that he has the defense of relying on the advice of counsel, which is an actual defense, but it's an affirmative defense, so the defendant has to prove it, and it has certain elements that never really got brought up on the Sunday shows, and I'll talk about that a little more after we watch George Stephanopoulos talk about. You'll see both George Stephanopoulos and Chuck Todd try to erode the right to counsel defense by saying John Eastman, the legal genius behind this whole vice president has the right to reject votes scheme, that he's not that great a scholar and he didn't even really believe it, and that's how they try to undermine it, but they don't really talk about what you need to prove to use the right to counsel defense. So I'll critique that after first we watch George Stephanopoulos and John Lauro in this clip.
Let's start with the man who's probably turning out to be one of the top, if not the chief witness for the prosecution in this case, former Vice President Mike Pence. He's taken issue with your contention that President Trump was simply asking him to pause the certification. Let's take a look.
American people deserve to know that President Trump and his advisors didn't just ask me to pause. They asked me to reject votes, return votes, essentially to overturn the election.
What's your response?
Yeah. Mike Pence will be one of our best witnesses at trial. I read his book very carefully. And if he testifies consistent with his book, then President Trump will be acquitted for these reasons. Number one, Mr. Pence recognizes that John Eastman, who was giving legal advice, was a renowned legal scholar. Number two, Vice President Pence recognized that there were discrepancies and fraud in connection with the election. He wanted it to be debated on Capitol Hill. Mr. Trump wanted it to be debated in the state legislatures. But make no mistake about it, based on what Vice President Pence will say, the government will never be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that President Trump had corrupt or criminal intent. And that's what this case is about.
Well, what Mike Pence has said all this week is that what President Trump did was wrong, and he knew it was wrong, and he was pressing him to do something that was wrong. It was also pretty clear.
He never said it was criminal.
He said it was wrong.
Never said it was criminal. There may be difference. You may think that somebody is acting inappropriately under constitutional principles, but Mr. Pence, who's a lawyer, never said to Mr. Trump, I think what you're doing is criminal, and that's very important. One of the things that, and you've been there is in White House meetings, a lot of options are on the table or discussed. The ultimate option that Mr. Trump asked for, President Trump asked for at the ellipse speech, was merely to pause the voting for a period of time to allow the state legislatures to weigh in.
For many days before that, he was insisting that they would reject the votes. He was making it very clear to Mr. Pence that he wanted them rejected. You're right that he eventually went to the ellipse and said, let's pause the votes. Now, even that, though, you talk about Mr. Eastman, even that, Mr. Eastman said was a violation of the law. So he didn't know that he was breaking the law.
No, he didn't say that.
He actually did say that. And
no,
he wrote it as a minor violation of the law.
He said that the Electoral Count Act was unconstitutional, and the only thing that's required under the Electoral Count Act is a vote on January 6th, with Mr. Eastman said, which is very important.
That it was a violation.
No, but you have to let me finish. You have to let me finish.
Yeah, but I'm just responding to something.
Because what Mr. Eastman said is that the Constitution is superior to any statute, and it trumps the Electoral Count Act. What he was saying is that ultimately the right of the state legislatures under the Constitution exists to weigh in on this issue, to recertify or audit. So what Mr. Eastman was saying, and Mr. Trump is not a lawyer. Let's understand that. He's a political leader and a businessman. What Mr. Eastman was saying as an attorney is that there's a constitutional pathway to making this ask. And one thing that Mr. Trump did, he only asked. You're allowed to petition your government for redress of grievances. A president is even allowed to petition his vice president. That has never been criminalized before. This is the first time
because
this happened.
It was the first time he's ever tried to stop a certification of the vote. You talked about Mr. Eastman right there. Mr. Eastman did say that he believed that rejecting the certification would lose 9-0 in the Supreme Court.
But that option was not the ultimate one that was asked. And all of those points, most importantly, were discussed among counsel in a meeting in terms of the opportunity for people to weigh in. These kinds of...
wait, hold on. I have to stop you there because that's actually not accurate. Mr. Trump excluded his White House counsel from the ultimate meeting with Mr. Eastman because he didn't want his White House counsel there because his White House counsel was telling him it was wrong.
But Vice President Pence had his lawyers there. And also you had Mr. Eastman there
and he said
to make that pitch.
And the bottom, crazy.
But that's fine. That's what happens in constitutional debates. People disagree all the time about constitutional points, but nobody gets indicted. These are not criminal cases. This is how the electoral system works out. Nothing is more important and sacred than political speech.
And that will be sorted out.
And you have to have the ability, even in the White House, to discuss these various political and constitutional options.
And that will be adjudicated in the court. It's good to see that you're welcoming Mr. Pence as a witness. President Trump also said this week that he never told Mike Pence that he is, quote, too honest, as alleged in the indictment.
That was a fun question, too, about whether Trump would actually testify and say that he didn't say that, because Mike Pence, apparently in his testimony to the grand jury, said that Trump said, Mike Pence, you're too honest. And he's even like printed up T-shirts about that. And that kind of rings true to me. But one thing that George Stephanopoulos tried to get to there, but I don't think made really clear, that John Lauro kept saying, ultimately Trump only asked for a pause in the votes, that he wanted Mike Pence to pause the certification and send it back to the state legislatures. And the word ultimately there, that's like the key word that it's like the weasel word he's using to try to hide the fact that, well, the reason that happened is they actually wanted Mike Pence to reject the votes and send the whole election into the House of Representatives, but Mike Pence said no. And the thing is, remember what Bill Barr said in that first Newsmaker clip I showed you, a conspiracy is complete when people agree on doing it and there's an overt act towards it, towards the completion. So even if the conspiracy to get Mike Pence to reject the votes wasn't completed, once they conspired to do that, that fulfills both the conspiracy to defraud the United States statute and the conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding statute. So they don't have to be successful. No one has to be defrauded. They just have to try. They just have to aspirationally ask, as John Lauro kept saying. And then one more thing I want to say about relying on John Eastman. You know, Trump's not a lawyer. He's just relying on counsel. Well, relying on counsel is an affirmative defense that the defendant has to prove. I think Bill Barr said it means Trump would have to take the stand, but that's not necessarily true. John Eastman might be able to take the stand, but it does it opens up attorney-client privilege. So the government could look at all the correspondence and all the notes between Trump and John Eastman. And there are a couple of other requirements. Here's the criminal jury instruction from the Ninth Circuit on asserting advice of counsel. I've highlighted this one part here that says, in order to assert advice of counsel, a defendant must have made a full disclosure of all material facts to his or her attorney, received advice as to specific course of conduct that he or she followed, and relied on the advice in good faith. So the two things that Trump would have to prove there that I think might be very difficult, one of the elements of the defense of reliance on counsel is candor, full candor with your attorney. Do you think Trump is going to be able to prove that he told the full truth to anyone ever? Anyone ever? Never mind John Eastman or anyone else. He's always spinning. He's always lying. So he's never going to meet the full candor element. And then acting on the advice in good faith. So that means that he just did what he was told. He followed his attorney's instructions and did no more, didn't say anything beyond that, did exactly what he was supposed to do under the law according to his attorney. And when has Trump ever been that disciplined and that controlled and that able to follow attorney instructions? Never. So there are some like basic elements to reliance on counsel that Trump will never be able to meet. That's why that's kind of bogus. Here you'll see John Lauro try to respond specifically to something Bill Barr said about reliance on counsel, that Trump would have to testify and would open up attorney-client privilege. I don't think he necessarily would have to testify, which John Lauro pounces on, but doesn't get cross-examined on the necessity that Trump was completely candid with his counsel and followed his counsel's advice completely in good faith. Anyway, I'll talk about that a little more after we watch that final Newsmaker clip together over here.
You mentioned that he had the right to do all these things. Well, he did all of those things. He filed his petitions in court. He got a couple of recounts. All of the everything you outlined as saying he had the right to do, he did have the right to do. He executed that strategy, and apparently when he didn't get the result that he liked, then he kept looking for another strategy. At what point does he accept the truth that he didn't win?
Well, he believes he won, and the Biden administration will never be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he didn't. But what he's being indicted for ultimately is following legal advice from an esteemed scholar, John Eastman, that he could petition his own vice president and ask his vice president to pause the voting on January 6th to give the states one last chance to certify or re-audit. That was the ultimate ask that President Trump made in his ellipse speech. That's clearly protected. Let's go back, if we could, and see what was going on January 6th. Both Vice President Pence and President Trump saw that they had 10 million votes more than they had in 2016. No president has ever lost under those circumstances. They also saw that Joe Biden outperformed Hillary Clinton by 15 million votes even though she was an inspirational candidate and Joe Biden was sitting at home in his basement. They also saw that President Trump won almost all of the disputed counties. In addition, they had over 1,000 people come forward and under oath say that there were discrepancies in the election. And finally, and most importantly, what President Trump and Vice President Pence saw were that the rules of the game had been changed by local electoral officials contrary to the state legislatures. So he took what he was entitled to do, which was petition Vice President Pence on January 6th. Once that petition was completed and Vice President Pence rejected his position, it was over and there was a peaceful transition of power.
I'm going to look, I got to unpack a couple of those things there because some of it is just sort of political spin, and I understand that. But let me get to this issue of the esteemed legal scholars.
No, it's part of our legal
defense. Hang on a minute.
defense.
The esteemed, I understand that. The esteemed legal scholars. Here's what the former Attorney General Bill Barr said about that strategy. I want to get you to react to it.
I don't think this defensive advice of counsel is going to go forward, because I think the president would have to get on the stand and subject himself to cross-examination in order to raise that, and he'd also have to waive attorney-client privilege.
Is the former president going to take the stand?
Advice of counsel can be raised without anyone taking the stand. That's just plain wrong. But what we had was a very, very thoughtful memo by John Eastman, who was a professor of law, dean of a law school, head of a constitutional scholarship program, and well understood and well renowned. He had been a Supreme Court clerk and a Fourth Circuit clerk. Even Mike Pence said he was the legal scholar that was developing a lot of these points. People disagree about constitutional principles all the time. Certainly, Mr. Barr may have disagreed with Mr. Eastman. That happens every day in our government. It never leads to a criminal charge. But one thing for certain, President Trump acted under the advice of counsel when he petitioned, under the First Amendment, petitioned Mr. Pence.
So let me understand
and that's legally protected speech.
So what you're arguing is if the president did violate the law, he did so because he got advice from counsel to violate the law?
No, that's what people misunderstand. In order to have a violation of law, you have to have criminal intent, and in this case, corrupt intent. And what that means is that you have to have some desire to do something unlawful. If your attorney is telling you that you have a right to petition Congress, then that completely eliminates any criminal intent. So under those circumstances, you are not violating the law. Your actions require you to state your position, but it's not a violation, so you would be acquitted.
Well, there are a couple problems there. I mostly talked about it before I showed the clip, but also when they talked to Mike Pence, not only I talked about how Trump probably wasn't completely candid with his attorney because he can't be completely candid with anyone, but you can't follow your attorney's advice in good faith when you know that the argument you're making based on what your attorney told you, that, you know, the vice president has the ability to reject these electors based on outcome determinative fraud, but all the evidence that you're talking about, and this is in the indictment. Like I said, read the indictment. I put a link down under sources. I think it's the first one, the full indictment on the Justice Department website. They talk about all the specific false claims of fraud, the undocumented voters in Arizona, the massive dumps of votes in Michigan. They're like Pennsylvania, Georgia. They go through like state after state, and Trump made specific allegations to state legislators. He made specific false statements to Mike Pence about fraud that he knew was not true. So it goes much beyond what John Lauro said there. So that's not relying in good faith on what your counsel told you if you're adding all these falsehoods to this legal theory that John Eastman, you know, it was not just the legal theory, it was all these falsehoods about specific allegations of voter fraud that they knew were not true. not the general, I don't believe I lost the election, Trump can never believe he lost anything ever, the power of positive thinking, the Norman Vincent Peale thing that has Trump like living in a different reality from the rest of us. That is not a defense to these charges when they're saying they're making specific allegations they know are false, to defraud the United States, to obstruct an official proceeding, to conspire to obstruct an official proceeding, and to conspire to take away people's right to vote and have their votes counted. Those are the statutes I talked to you about. I also talked to you about the requirements of the right to counsel. So I think I've explained why I believe that on these particular charges, Trump does not have a free speech defense or a reliance on counsel defense. We'll see where this all goes. Hopefully it will be televised like earlier in the program Tom Trask was asking me. That would be a great way for me to do some extra live streams. I will be doing a live stream every Monday all the way through January 2025, when our current president will be re-inaugurated or someone else will be. Who knows what's going to happen? But I will cover all the way through the January 2025 inauguration of our next or current president or whatever happens. Hopefully I'll be able to cover multiple Trump criminal trials, and then August 23rd, the first Republican debate. So there's a lot of stuff coming up. I appreciate all of you who joined the live show, my recorded show viewers. I will be back next Monday, every Monday for over a year now, and until the next time I have to upload a video or my next Monday media mix-up, I guess I will be seeing all of you around the internet.